One day, Mr. Oldcastle wrote a letter. It was a most important letter to his grandson, Dan. It was also very important to get the letter into the postbox as early as possible. Mr. Oldcastle jumped into his trusty vintage car, Gumdrop, and drove off to the postbox. As he arrived, the postman was already there collecting the letters from the box in his little red post office van. Mr. Oldcastle started to run. "I say, please wait for me," he panted. He was running as fast as he could, but the postman didn't hear him. He hopped into his van and drove off. Unfortunately for Mr. Oldcastle, that was the last post of the day. Mr. Oldcastle quickly decided to catch up with the post van in Gumdrop. He waved the letter to catch the postman's attention, but the red van was going faster and disappeared from view. He arrived at the centre of the village, but there was no sign of the red van. Mr. Oldcastle decided to ask the bus driver. "Have you seen the little red post office van?" he called out. "Yes," shouted back the driver over all the noise. "There she goes up that twisty, narrow street." It was just disappearing around the corner. Mr. Oldcastle drove out of the village into the narrow country lanes and found his way barred by a large lorry, so he asked the driver if he'd seen the red van. "There she goes up the other road," cried the lorry driver. He could see because he was much higher up than Mr. Oldcastle. "But that old car of yours will never catch her." "Gumdrop is better than most," said Mr. Oldcastle. The sheep in the field thought so too. Mr. Oldcastle reversed and followed the red van up the road. But, oh dear, he hadn't gone very far when he was stopped again. A very large crane was crossing the road. It rattled and clanked and went very slowly. The workmen stood and waited, and the red van disappeared into the distance. "What a lot of trouble to post a letter! But we'll catch the post yet," said Mr. Oldcastle, and drove on when the crane had passed. He drove on down the road and came to a roundabout. "Where's that red van got to now?" he asked himself as he drove round the roundabout. He spoke so loudly that a tractor driver heard him. "There she goes," said the tractor driver, pointing back up the road. Mr. Oldcastle drove round the roundabout, past the tractor, and up the road towards the van. "You'd better hurry," the tractor driver shouted after him. Mr. Oldcastle arrived at a railway bridge, but there was no sign of the little red post office van. Then he looked up and saw a train crossing the bridge. "Have you seen the red post office van?" cried Mr. Oldcastle. "There she goes," shouted the train driver, pointing to a hill in the distance. "But you'll never catch her up that hill in that old car." But Mr. Oldcastle had to try. The road was so steep that Mr. Oldcastle hopped out to help push Gumdrop to the top of the hill. Then he looked around for the red van, and there below him was the postman, looking at some cows. "Now we'll catch him," cried Mr. Oldcastle as he coasted down the road towards the little red van. He arrived just in time to stop the postman from driving off again. "I have a most important letter from my grandson Dan," he told the postman. "Please can you post it for me? It's an important birthday matter." And he passed the letter over to the postman. "I shall be delighted," said the postman. He liked to take urgent letters, so he drove away feeling most important. The red van disappeared up the road, and Mr. Oldcastle felt very pleased with himself. "And now for home again," he said, but realized that he didn't know the way. He'd turned so many corners that he was lost. Then he saw the signpost. "My word!" he exclaimed in surprise. "That red van led me straight here to the home of my little Dan." With that, he drove into the village. He stopped outside Dan's house, and Dan ran down the lane towards him. "Grandad," he called out, "did you come for my birthday after all?" "Not really," said Mr. Oldcastle. "As a matter of fact, I've just posted you a letter." "That's great," said Dan. "I'll have you now and the letter later." And they both burst out laughing. Dan's mum and dad wondered what it was all about, but they were pleased that Grandad had arrived.